Hello, this is Sherri Gallagher with Technacon Company Incorporated. This presentation is on support, which is Section 7 of ISO 9001-2015. So what are the support functions? This is the point where an auditor moves from interviewing top management to interviewing middle management and the workforce in general. These are the responsibilities top management delegated. This section of the standard has 4 different elements relating to making production work. They are people, which includes organizational knowledge, competence, and awareness, as well as the work environment and infrastructure. Communication, who, what, to whom, when, and how. Monitoring and measuring, which is focusing on calibration and software validation. And documented information, which is procedures, work instructions, forms, training documents, videos, and records. You may have noticed that I took these in a different order than the ISO 9001 standard prints them. The standard starts out with a general category of resources. It makes a broad statement about people, then goes on to infrastructure and work environment, and the tools to monitor and measure. It then goes to organizational knowledge, which is related to people. The next 2 major sections, competence and awareness, are again related to people and knowledge. I've chosen to group all these elements addressing people and count them as one element. So let's talk about people. The first requirement is the transition from top management to the rest of the company. The directive is to select the right people to do the job. Top management has decided in the scope what will be done in-house and what will not. If this is an internet security company, then people with strong computer skills are needed. If this is a tool and die maker, then people skilled in precision machining are needed. If the product requires to be plated, will it be done in-house or contracted out? Management has already answered these questions by defining the scope, the quality policy, and the quality objectives. Now, human resources is tasked with finding the right people. Human resources must identify the necessary competence for each position. Typically, HR will do this with job descriptions. Job descriptions should be revision controlled and are part of documented information. Awareness is usually covered in training. New employees are shown the quality policy and trained on the perception the company wants people to have. Employees are also shown or may participate in developing the quality objectives and should have an understanding of their personal contribution to achieving those objectives and their impact on creating product that meets requirements. Part of awareness is organizational knowledge. Organizational knowledge should be transferred to employees performing the work through training programs. Many programs consist of the employee currently performing the task, training others to do the same thing. While this meets the minimum of the standard, there are inherent issues in not having a documented training script and/or video. For example, the employee performing the task may know that a few years earlier there was an issue with the product being damaged in shipment. To prevent the damage, protective packing was added to the corners of the product. A new employee in training will be taught the task of adding the corners to the product, but may not be made aware of why the corners are being added. So the new employee decides they can reduce expense and waste of the added packing materials if they don't use them. They may even turn in a suggestion that this is an improvement. This causes the previous problem to return. So the organizational knowledge is lost if it's just one person verbally training another. Training scripts and/or videos help to maintain organizational knowledge, and wherever possible should explain why a task is being performed to help employees in their day-to-day decision making. Included under people is the impact of infrastructure and work environment. In prior editions of the standard, the auditor was directed to make sure the infrastructure and work environment was adequate. There was not a lot of guidance in what to look for. Usually, if the roof wasn't leaking and the air temperature was slightly moderated to make it livable, and the lighting was adequate, the infrastructure was considered adequate. With ISO 9001:2015, the auditor must look at buildings as well as software information technologies, which has become more important since 2008. And they must determine if they are adequately supported in the work performance. So, looking at leaking roofs and looking at lighting is not the only thing that must be looked at. Does the environment fatigue the person? A clarification was also added in the 2015 edition to the work environment. The auditor must take into account the social and psychological factors as well as the physical factors that could influence the conformance of product. The auditor takes their guidance from the impact on the conformance of the product. This is not an easy task for the auditor. It's usually a very difficult finding to write since findings must be based on observed evidence. And it's very difficult to observe and provide evidence to social or psychological factors. All right, let's move on to communication. This is one of the most concise sections of the standard. The organization will determine what it will and will not communicate, when it will communicate, who will receive the communication, how the communication will occur, and who will do the communicating. This applies both internally and externally. An external example is a pharmaceutical company deciding who, when, and how a recall is communicated. Internally, top management may decide certain financial information will not be communicated to employees. Communication is decided by the organization and varies from business to business. There is no requirement to document the communication plan. Communication is fairly straightforward. Communication can be related to documented information when documented information is used to do the communicating. We'll get into that in documented information. Now let's look at monitoring and measuring resources. Monitoring and measuring resources still focuses mainly on calibration. The term resources is used so auditors will also look at software and any tool being used to determine conformance to requirements. One of the nice clarifications in ISO 9001:2015 for auditors is considering calibration as not applicable. This is important when auditing service industries, and some auditors struggled with how to handle this element under previous editions of the standard. The ability to not audit calibration is much clearer in the 2015 edition of ISO 9001. When I am consulting, I warn my clients calibration is the auditor candy store for findings. Most auditors have the ability to find that one single measuring device that is past its calibration due date but still in use. So beyond having everything in calibration, some of the things to look for are is the correct device being used for the measurement tolerance. If the measurement tolerance is plus or minus 1/1000th, then you want to use a micrometer or a caliper. If the measurement tolerance is plus or minus 1/2 inch, then a ruler or tape measure is a better tool than a micrometer. All measuring devices must be traceable to a national standard such as NITS, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Yup, even that commercially purchased ruler or tape measure must be traceable to a national standard. The organization should also have a plan to address what will be done if a gauge that has been used to accept product is found out of calibration. An organization should be able to identify what product was tested with which gauge and decide if the product has to be retested or not. One of the ways I have seen clients to avoid the need for retesting is to use a gauge with a higher precision than is necessary. If the gauge is found to be slightly out of calibration, the company can show it would not affect product conformance, and therefore product does not need to be retested. This still shouldn't create the situation of using a micrometer instead of a ruler. All devices used to determine conformance must be evaluated to ensure their continued fitness for use. If the organization has created a specialty gauge, the organization must define the gauge's accuracy and fitness for use. If a gauge is not standardized, a method that may be used to define its measurement capability is a gauge repeatability and reproducibility study. This is not a requirement of ISO 9001, this repeatability and reproducibility study, but it can be accepted by an auditor for identifying the standardization of a gauge. You must expect a lot of questions if your organization is in this situation and is using an R&R study. Finally, a software is used to test performance to requirements. The software must be validated as effective. This usually applies to proprietary software. Commercially available software does not need to be validated, and software used in the office and not used to determine conformance to requirements like Excel or Microsoft Word does not require validation by the organization for ISO 9001-2015. It only applies to software being used to identify conformance to requirements and that is proprietary and has been developed and is not commercially available. So now we finally get to documented information. Documented information is a new term, but not a new understanding. The organization must determine what needs to be documented, how long documents will be maintained, where they can be found, how they are generated and updated, and who is the deciding authority for acceptance. Documents must be readily available at the point of use and protected from deterioration. This is that loop back to communication in Section 7.4 of ISO 9001-2015. Documented information is considered an acceptable tool for communication. Historically, procedures and work instructions met this requirement, and it is perfectly acceptable to continue to use procedures and work instructions to communicate. What is new is the standard now allows the auditor to take into account the size of the organization and the complexity of the product. There is no longer a requirement for specific procedures, since some companies may be able to control the quality management system without them. For example, I have one client who uses videos in place of procedures. While the procedure is not needed, the organization must communicate the documented information. The key is the organization decides what needs to be documented, but once that decision is made, the documents must be followed. Documented information includes what the 2008 and earlier editions identified as records. Records are evidence of conformity to the standard, and they must also be protected from deterioration, damage, or alteration. Now note I said conformity to the standard and not just conformity of product. It is both. Conformity to the standard requires documented information for things like management review. So it's conformity to the standard as well as conformity of product to requirements. This documented information that was previously thought of as records must have the storage and retention and disposition defined and implemented. Now, a decade or so ago, some auditors were writing findings for failure to dispose of records. The finding was usually based on a failure to follow the disposal time identified by the organization as necessary. Some auditors out there may still write this. I haven't run into it, but they could. The easiest way to avoid this finding is to define a minimum retention period and a disposable method. If records are retained for a longer period, it is not a finding as long as a maximum retention time is not defined. So that's it, folks. That's support. So in conclusion, there's very little of these requirements which are new. In most cases, they've been renamed, and the auditor has been given the leeway to determine if they're adequately addressed, considering the size of the company and the complexity of the product. If you have any questions, you can contact me at my email, technacon1986@sbcglobal.net, or you can call me at my cell phone, or you can check us out on technacon.com. So the next presentations to be put together will be on Section 8 of the standard, which is operations. Now I'm going to break that one into two parts and take design as a separate element and then all the rest of operations as a second part. Feel free to check them out. Have a wonderful day.